Today's story is all about two young men who were executed in the military barracks in Waterford in January 1923, but it requires a bit of context. So I need to go back to the very beginning of the foundation of the Irish Free State to demonstrate exactly what happened. Now, in my opinion, what happened with the Irish Free State is this, is that many of the great leaders in the independence struggle were great nationalists. Guys like Richard Mulcahy and that. They were great, but they were not revolutionaries. And a lot of the revolutionaries decided to go against the establishment of the Free State, which led to a disastrous civil war. So the Irish Free State came into being in January the 7th, 1922. And part of that, we all know that, okay, the Irish Free State was established, but part of that required that the Senate be set up, right? We still have a Senate today, but part of the agreement was that it would represent all shades of opinion in Ireland, and that meant Unionists, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, the whole shooting gallery, academics, professors, the whole lot. So there were 60 members belonging to the first Senate. 30 were elected by the Dáil, and the other 30 were appointed by Cosgrave, the president of the Free State. And he went around and he searched Ireland, all around Ireland, and he found every lord and lady and unionist and put him in. And as a result, as time went on, and when Fianna Fáil came into power in the 1930s, they opposed everything. So De Valera wanted to get rid of the oath to the King of England, because that was required under the Free State institution, that we would be part of the Dominion of Great Britain. And so they objected against that, and they obstructed the removal of the oath. So De Valera went and abolished the Senate in 1936. So that's what happened as time went on, and it became increasingly more bitter. Now, the Civil War began in Ireland because of that fracture amongst the varying shades of republicanism, those who wanted a 32-county republic and those who were satisfied with the 26-county Irish Free State. It started on the 28th of June 1922. Now, the government decided to bring in, because they occupied the forecourts and that, and so the Free State government decided to bring in powers that would essentially frighten them. But it didn't really frighten them. So they brought in the Special Powers Act, and they decided to execute people who were found in military action, that's IRA members. So the executions at the beginning were essentially in Dublin, and they began in November the 17th, and there was 4 or 5 young Dublin lads executed in Dublin. And then on December the 8th, they executed a very, very important Republican who sided with the IRA. His name was Erskine Childers. His son later went on to become President of Ireland. But Childers was hated by a lot of Irish people because he was English, and he had been an intelligence officer before it. But he was a highly intellectual man, very intelligent, and he's the one that all the time, when the Free State, when the treaty negotiations were gone, he was all the time for the Irish Republic. He was hated by fellows like Collins, he was hated by Richard Mulcahy, and he was even more hated by the English, who saw him as a traitor. And it was essentially the English who determined that Childers has to go. So they executed Erskine Childers again on December the 8th, 1922. Kevin O'Higgins was the Minister for Justice and of the Free State, and also the Vice President of the Free State. He said that, these killings in Dublin are having no effect. So I think that there should be IRA men from every county executed. And that's what happened. They began to move around. On December the 8th, shortly after the execution of Erskine Childers, another 4 top IRA leaders were executed. And the man who signed the warrant was Kevin O'Higgins, the Minister of Justice of the Irish Free State. And one of the fellows to be executed was a fellow called Rory O'Connor. Now, this is how much of a tragedy the Civil War was, because Rory O'Connor was Kevin O'Higgins' best man at his wedding. And as a present at the wedding, Kevin O'Higgins gave 2 gold sovereigns to Rory O'Connor as a present for doing best man for him. And on the day that Rory O'Connor was brought out to be executed, he had the 2 of those gold sovereigns in his pocket. He was buried with those 2 sovereigns in his pocket. What a tragedy. Erskine Childers, when he was executed because he had been found with a pistol that Michael Collins had given him during the War of Independence. What a tragedy. Erskine Childers was the oldest fellow that was executed during the Civil War. He was 52. The youngest was 18. And you could say the average age of most of those executed by the Irish Free State forces at that time would have been in their early 20s. Now, the idealists, some of them might have been even too young to fight at the beginning of the War of Independence. But they did anyway. So that was the age. It was a terrible time, terrible retribution. There was even more killings. 77 were actually executed, but there was a hell of a lot more went on than that. On both sides, there were some terrible atrocities. In actual fact, there were war crimes. 2 young IRA volunteers, there were Patrick O'Reilly and Michael Fitzgerald. Both of them were from Youghal in County Cork, but they were caught up in County Waterford with guns, and they were taken down to Waterford, and they were tried in Waterford, and they were sentenced to death to be executed by firing squad. But I want to read what appeared in the Waterford papers, and this was a statement from the Army Publicity Department, and it says, Michael Fitzgerald, South Main Street, Youghal, and Patrick O'Reilly, Coast Guard Station, Youghal, were tried by military court on the charge of having possession without proper authority of arms and ammunition at Ballinaclash, Clashmore, County Waterford, on the 4th of December 1922. Both accused were found guilty and sentenced to death, and finding that sentence was duly concerned, and the execution took place this morning in Waterford at 8 o'clock. So I was very lucky to meet a man who would have been very, very young at the time, but his mother told him all about hearing this commotion outside one morning. They lived down on the Barrack Street end of Green Street, and looking out the window they saw these 2 young boys coming up Green Street being marched to the military barracks, and they were shouting, "Up Cork and long live the Republic." Next thing, they went around the corner onto Barrack Street, and the next thing she heard was guns being fired. They were executed in the ball alley in the barracks. Now, the ball alley would back down to Green Street, and you can see the wreath is there to the present day and is commemorated by many groups, by Sinn Féin and the Workers' Party, and every year. So that's there, and I suppose there are hundreds of people walk past that every day in Green Street, not knowing what went on. As I said, it was a terrible time, and 77 IRA men were executed. Pax Whelan, he was a brigadier general, he was a Dungarvan man, and he tells an absolutely brilliant story about the 2 young boys, Reilly and Fitzgerald. And he said that there was a family up there, they were kind of like the landed gentry. The Hollyrod Smith was the name of them. They lived in Ballinatray House up there by Youghal. And Pax Whelan and some of the IRA lads had did a favour for the Hollyrods during the War of Independence. There was a break-in or a robbery or whatever, and Pax and the lads sorted it out. So Hollyrod Smith said to Pax, "Look, if you ever need a favour, don't know what will ever have to be or anything, but please come along and contact us." And they did. So Pax went up to Mrs. Hollyrod Smith and said he knew she was a great friend of Cosgrave, the president of the Irish Free State. And he said, "Look, these are only young fellas." He said, "Is there any way you could have a chance with them and see if they can have the death penalty removed, put them into prison?" Because one of the lads, Patrick O'Reilly, his brother, was also arrested having guns on him, but he got a couple of years in jail. He wasn't sentenced to be killed. So anyway, Mrs. Hollyrod Smith came back to Pax and she said, "Cosgrave told me there's nothing he can do." Now imagine this is the president of the Free State saying this. "There's nothing I could do about it. The British wants him dead." You see, they had been involved in an IRA attack. During the War of Independence, this is not during the Civil War, during the War of Independence, both of them had been involved in an IRA unit that laid a mine on the road, and a bus rode over it and was blown up. Unfortunately, the bus was full of young guys who were in the band. They were only band boys, they were called. And it was a tragedy that they were so young, but they were killed. So the British wanted them dead. That's it. Simple as that. And the Free State bowed to the request to have these young fellas killed. So that's it. And that's why the bitterness lasted so long. Now, for me, that's not the end of the story. Because my granduncle, his name was John Creed, and he lived about 4 doors up from us in Dysart, and he was a quartermaster in the IRA in the War of Independence, and also he took the Republican side in the Civil War. Now, the Civil War ended in May 1923, but he was in jail, in Ballybricken jail. And his youngest son died. His name was John. He was called after his father. And they wouldn't allow him out on compassionate leave to attend a funeral. So they brought him up to an office up overlooking Ballybricken, and they brought the funeral over Ballybricken so that he could look out the window at the funeral of his youngest son. And who told me that he looked out the window was the man who brought him his breakfast at the time from the Metropole Hotel up. He worked in the kitchen in the Metropole, and he brought John's breakfast up to him that morning. I suppose he was getting a bit of a treat because of the tragedy and all that. People like my granduncle John Creed, they never forgot the 32 county republic ideal. And as a matter of fact, I'm not ashamed to say it, when the violence broke out in 69-70 up the north of Ireland, and the Catholics were being attacked up there, and what they were looking at that stage, there was no provisional IRA, there was nothing up there except the civil rights movement. And so eventually the provisional IRA did form. And I do know they contacted my granduncle, see if he had any guns, and he did. And he sent him, gave them to him, some County Waterford, I should say, IRA men, and they brought it up to the God made sure that they went up to the north to defend the Catholic population. That's it, and that's why the bitterness lasted so long, and that's why so many, and this is an interesting point too, that an awful lot of people, like my granduncle, couldn't get a job in Waterford after the Civil War. He eventually started up a piggery in his backyard in Dial Street, and I remember I often went around on the horse and car, on an ass and cart, collecting skins, bringing them up to him to feed the pigs. We used to go around sometimes with some of the lads, and people would come out and give us buckets of old food, leftovers of food in buckets, throw it into a big barrel, and up we go up the back in Dial Street up to my granduncle John Creed, and he then give it all out to the pigs, and he became a wealthy man out of it. But an awful lot of people had to leave the country, and that's why during the 1970s there were so many people from America. There would have been sons and grandsons of IRA leaders who supported the provisional IRA in the north. Sent the money for guns, that's it. So there's no big deal about it. That bitterness failed to leave all these people who had to leave the country, who wanted a 32 county republic. So that's today's story. Hope you enjoyed it, and have another great story coming up very soon for you. Talk to you soon.
We'll sing of those heroes, the valiant, who fell by the shore's glancing wave. Now they sleep by the banks of black water, when their comrades, the dauntless and brave, they fought with the boys of the column, and answered young freedom's clear call. Brave Reilly and gallant Fitzgerald, who died with their backs to the wall.